Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight, we travel back, not decades, not centuries, but millions upon millions of years, into the deep river of time that quietly, patiently, shaped one of the most extraordinary creatures our planet has ever held. Imagine for a moment a high mountain slope in the Sichuan province of China. The hour is dusk. Cloud moves through ancient fir trees like slow breath, softening every edge, muffling every sound. Below the tree line, a forest of bamboo stands perfectly still. The stalks are pale green in the fading light, their leaves barely trembling. The air smells of wet stone and cold earth and something green and alive. And somewhere in that hushed dimness, almost invisible, a giant panda sits and eats, unhurried, unbothered, as though time itself has agreed to slow down around it. Have you ever wondered what it might feel like to be shaped by a single forest? To be so completely at home in one place, one food, one quiet rhythm, that the rest of the world simply falls away? Have you ever considered that the animal we find so instantly comforting, that round face, those dark circled eyes, that improbable black and white coat, has been refined by millions of years of stillness and selection, arriving here in this moment, exactly as it was meant to be? If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, simply settle in. The story of the giant panda begins with the oldest question a naturalist can ask. Where did this creature come from? The answer reaches back somewhere between 8 million and perhaps as many as 12 million years, to a small, wandering ancestor that looked almost nothing like the animal we know today. It was smaller, more generalist in its diet, more restless in its ranging. And yet, somewhere inside that ancient creature, the blueprint for a panda was already waiting, folded into its bones, written into a future it could not imagine. We are going to follow that lineage tonight, gently, at the pace of deep time. There is nowhere to be, nothing to do, only this, the sound of bamboo in still air, the low drift of cloud through mountain firs, and the slow, patient unfolding of one remarkable story. The bamboo stem is cool and smooth beneath the panda's paw, and for a moment the animal is absolutely still, head tilted, eyes half closed, as though listening to something very far away. Perhaps it is, because underneath the quiet of this particular mountain morning, there is a much older sound. The slow, almost geological rumble of time branching into forms, lineages parting from one another, the way rivers part around an island, each current finding its own unhurried course toward the sea. To understand the giant panda, you have to be willing to travel back through that branching. You have to be willing to go a very long way, and there is no rush. The night is long, and the facts we are moving toward are as old and as calm as stone. 50 million years ago, give or take a few million years in either direction, the world was a warmer place. The poles were free of ice. Forests crept far northward and southward from the equator, dense and humid and full of a kind of green abundance that is difficult to imagine now. In those forests lived the earliest members of the order carnivora, not the lions and wolves and bears we know today, but small, watchful animals, many of them skilled climbers, moving through the canopy on flexible limbs, eating insects and fruit and small vertebrates with equal willingness. These creatures are sometimes called myocoids, though the taxonomy has shifted over the decades, and the precise family tree remains a subject of careful scientific conversation. What matters for our purposes, resting here in the dark, is simply this. Those small animals in those ancient forests carried within their bodies the genetic instructions that would eventually, across tens of millions of years, give rise to every carnivore alive today. Every wolf, every seal, every bear, and eventually, with extraordinary patience, every giant panda. The order Carnivora is old then, rooted in the warm Eocene world, and its early members were nothing like the large, powerful animals the name might suggest. They were modest in size, opportunistic in diet, and they lived in a world so different from ours that even the continents were arranged differently beneath their feet. Europe and Asia were separated by a shallow inland sea. The Atlantic was narrower. India was still moving northward toward its slow collision with Asia, a collision that would eventually push up the Himalayas and, in doing so, help shape the very mountain forests where pandas would one day make their home. Though that is still a very long time from where we are now. From those early carnivorous ancestors, the lineages began to separate. The process was not dramatic. It was not a single moment of divergence, but rather a slow drift, like tectonic plates, populations becoming isolated by geography or climate, adapting to local conditions, generation by generation accumulating small differences until, looked back upon from the far future, they had become something new. By the late Eocene and into the early Oligocene, roughly 34 to 37 million years ago, the family Uacidae, the true bears, was beginning to take shape, splitting away from the broader carnivorous stream. The common ancestor of all living bears was not itself a bear in the way we picture bears now. It was smaller, more generalist, an animal whose descendants would eventually radiate outward across time into the remarkable diversity of ursids alive today. Polar bears, sun bears, spectacled bears, sloth bears, brown bears, American black bears, Asiatic black bears, and the giant panda. 8 living species, each with its own particular genius, each shaped by millions of years of separation and local adaptation. And of all those 8, the giant panda represents something remarkable in the structure of the family tree. Molecular evidence, the careful reading of DNA, matching sequences across species, and calculating how long ago they diverged based on known mutation rates, places the giant panda as the earliest branch of the bear tree, the first lineage to separate from all the others. The split between the giant panda's ancestors and the ancestors of all other living bears may have occurred somewhere around 20 to 22 million years ago, during the Miocene epoch, a time of global cooling and shifting landscapes. This means that when you look at the panda's family tree, it sits alone on one side, and every other bear alive today, from the polar bear hunting on Arctic ice to the sun bear moving through lowland rainforest in Borneo, sits on the other side. The panda's branch is the deepest, the oldest, the first to find its own solitary course. There is something quietly astonishing about that if you sit with it for a moment. The giant panda is not a strange or failed bear. It is not an evolutionary mistake, not an animal that somehow lost its way. It is, in a very precise sense, the most ancient branch of a very ancient family, carrying a lineage that has been separate and distinct for longer than any other living bear. When the panda reaches into the bamboo, it does so with a paw shaped by 22 million years of independent history. That history is written in its bones, in its digestion, in the strange wrist bone, technically a modified radial sesamoid, that functions like a sixth finger, allowing the animal to grip bamboo stalks with a precision no other bear possesses. 22 million years of going its own way, Here is something else worth noting gently as you settle towards sleep. The giant panda shares its common name with another animal, the red panda, a small, rust-colored, raccoon-like creature that also lives in bamboo forests and also eats bamboo as a primary food. For a long time, scientists debated whether these two animals were closely related, whether they shared a bamboo-eating ancestor or belonged to the same family. The answer, as molecular and fossil evidence gradually made clear, is that they do not. The giant panda is a bear. The red panda belongs to its own family, Unhurried, more closely related to weasels and raccoons than to bears. They share a diet, a habitat, and a name, but their resemblance is what biologists call convergence. Independent evolution arriving at similar solutions to similar problems. Two separate lineages, separated by deep evolutionary time, both discovered that bamboo was abundant and reliable, and both found ways to live on it. The same trick, invented twice, in completely different bodies, across an almost unimaginable span of years. It is a reminder that nature is not a straight line, but a vast, patient experiment, running the same test in different laboratories, comparing notes across the millennia. The earliest fossil bears, the ancestors closest to the root of the Eocene family tree, come to us from rocks in Europe and Asia, some dating to the late Eocene and early Holocene. They bear names like Ursavus and Cephalogale. Small animals, lightly built, probably omnivorous in the broad sense, eating whatever the forest offered. Nothing about them shouts panda. Nothing suggests bamboo or Sichuan, or the particular slow motion grace of a large black and white bear rolling in mountain grass. They are simply small, alert, tree-capable carnivores, beginning a journey that will take millions of years to arrive anywhere we might recognize. And yet, the instructions are already there, somewhere in their cells. The potential for the panda, waiting patiently for the right combination of time and circumstance and geography to bring it forward. This is one of the things that deep time thinking offers, if you let it work on you slowly. The understanding that every living thing you can name is the current endpoint of an unbroken chain, stretching back to the very beginning of life on this planet. The panda's lineage has never once, across 22 million years, failed to produce a surviving descendant. Every ancestor, back through time, lived long enough to reproduce. Every generation passed something forward. The chain held. It holds tonight, in the breathing of an animal asleep in a bamboo grove on a coal mountain in Sichuan. And it holds in you as well, in whatever ancient lineage your own cells remember. 50 million years is difficult to feel. 22 million years is difficult to feel. But you can approach the feeling, perhaps, by noticing the extraordinary patience of the process. No urgency, no rushing forward, just the slow accumulation of small changes, branching and branching again, until the world is full of the particular forms we now know and love and watch sleeping in the dark. The bear family branched. The panda's ancestors took the earliest path, the first turning, and followed it alone for 22 million years until they arrived here. Big, unhurried, almost entirely committed to bamboo, perfectly adapted to a world of coal mist and green stems and long, slow afternoons. They made it, against every statistical improbability, across every mass extinction and climate shift and geological upheaval. The lineage held, and the panda is here. Let that settle into you as you breathe. The oldest branch of an ancient family, still going, still reaching into the bamboo, still finding the stem that is exactly the right thickness, exactly the right moisture, exactly what has been needed for a very long time. The air carries something dense and green tonight. The smell of wet soil and broad leaves. The particular heaviness of a forest that has never known a hard frost. Let yourself settle into that warmth for a moment, breathing it in slowly, letting the humidity soften the edges of your thoughts. This is not Sichuan as you might picture it now, with its cold mountain mists and steep bamboo ridges. This is China, as it was perhaps 8 million years ago, in the long golden afternoon of the Miocene epoch, when the interior of the continent lay low and subtropical, when rivers wandered through floodplains thick with laurel and fig, when the world was several degrees warmer than the one you know, and the mountains had not yet risen to their full height. Somewhere in that lush, dripping lowland, moving quietly through the undergrowth, was a small bear, compact, dark-furred, unhurried, whose descendants would one day become the giant panda you carry in your mind right now. Breathe out slowly. That bear has been walking toward you for a very long time. The genus Ailuropoda, the direct and unbroken lineage of the giant panda, appears in the fossil record for the first time around 8 million years ago, embedded in the ancient sediments of southern China. The name means, loosely, cat-footed, a reference to the rounded, almost delicate impression those early paws left behind. But do not let the name mislead you into thinking these were small, tentative creatures. They were bears, fully and unmistakably, with the heavy jaw muscles and dense molars that speak of a diet already tilting toward tough plant material, toward the fibrous and the persistent. Paleontologists call these earliest members of the lineage pygmy pandas, not as a diminutive, but simply as a description of scale. They were noticeably smaller than the animal that lives in Sichuan today, perhaps the size of a medium dog, light enough to move through dense undergrowth without the deliberate rolling gait of their larger descendants. You can imagine them threading between roots, pausing to press their nose against a fallen log, curious and unhurried in the way that small, well-fed animals sometimes are. The world they moved through was extraordinary by any measure. The Miocene landscape of southern China was not a single ecosystem, but a shifting mosaic of subtropical forests, open woodlands, and wide river margins, all of it warm, all of it generously watered by monsoon rains that had not yet been interrupted by the rising plateau to the west. Elephants and tapirs moved through these forests. Ancestral deer and strange, long-necked relatives of the giraffe browsed the canopy edges. The rivers held giant soft-shell turtles, whose shells could span the length of a human arm. It was a world of abundance, of evolutionary experiment, of life testing its limits in every direction at once. And in the middle of it, quiet and methodical, the early Ailuropoda went about their business of finding and eating whatever the forest offered in greatest quantity. What the early pandas ate in that Miocene warmth is a question that fossil teeth can answer, at least partially. The molars of Ailuropoda from this period are already broadened and ridged in ways that suggest significant crushing force, the kind of dentition that handles tough, fibrous food rather than flesh. Bamboo was certainly present in Miocene China, growing in the lowland forests alongside dozens of other plant species, and the panda lineage may already have been experimenting with it, adding it to a broader diet that still included fruit, roots, and perhaps occasional animal protein. The full commitment to bamboo as an almost exclusive food source would come later, slowly, as options narrowed, and the plants that remained most reliably abundant were the ones that demanded the most patience to eat. Before we follow that narrowing, it is worth pausing on a detail that paleontologists find quietly remarkable. the fact that the panda lineage did not evolve in isolation. At roughly the same time that early Ailuropoda were moving through southern China, there were bear relatives in Europe, animals called Kretzoiarctos and Agriarctos, whose fossil teeth share certain features with the panda lineage, suggesting that the family of bears from which pandas eventually descended was once far more widespread than the panda's current range would lead you to believe. These European relatives did not give rise to the giant panda directly. They are more like distant cousins, branches that grew from the same ancient root and then diverged, adapted to their own landscapes, and eventually disappeared. But their existence hints at something that the fossil record makes plain time and again. The story of any living species is almost always the story of a much larger and more widespread family, most of whom are gone, leaving behind only a few descendants and the impressions they pressed into ancient mud. The giant panda is, in this sense, a survivor of a broader experiment, the last walker of a lineage that once had many more branches, many more faces, many more places it called home. Let that thought settle gently, without weight. You are breathing slowly now, shoulders loose. The warmth of this imagined Miocene forest still somewhere at the edge of awareness. The millions of years are not a burden. They are simply a measure of how long persistence can last when the conditions are right. Over the course of the Miocene and then through the Pliocene that followed, the Ailuropoda lineage continued to diversify and spread. Fossil panda relatives have been found not only across southern China, but also in what is now Vietnam and Myanmar, suggesting that the ancestral pandas range extended across a broad sweep of subtropical Asia. The animals that left these fossils were not identical to one another. They varied in size, in the precise shape of their teeth, in what the bones of their limbs suggest about how they moved. But they shared the essential architecture of the lineage: the heavy jaw, the broadened molar, the body plan of a bear that had decided the forest floor and its plant life were enough. At their widest extent, the ancestors of the giant panda occupied lowland forests across a region that would feel, to a modern eye, surprisingly warm and flat compared to the cold mountain bamboo forests where pandas live today. The mountains were there in the distance, but the pandas of the deep past did not need them. The lowlands provided everything: dense vegetation, reliable water, and bamboo growing in the shade of taller trees alongside dozens of other plant species. The retreat toward the mountains would come much later, driven not by any choice, but by the slow and inexorable pressure of a changing climate. As the Pliocene gave way to the Pleistocene, roughly 2.5 million years ago, the world began to cool. The great ice ages began their rhythm of advance and retreat, and even in southern Asia, where glaciers never descended to the lowlands, the temperature shifts were enough to alter forest composition, to push subtropical species southward or upward, to replace the warm mixed forests of the Miocene with cooler, more seasonal woodlands. The panda lineage adapted, as it had always adapted, slowly, incrementally, by following the food that remained most reliably available. And increasingly, that food was bamboo, which could grow in cooler upland forests where other plants struggled, which came back reliably after disturbance, which offered enormous quantities of material even if each mouthful delivered relatively little energy. The range of the Ailuropoda lineage, which had once stretched across a broad subtropical arc, began to contract, not all at once, and not without pauses and partial reversals as the climate cycled. But over hundreds of thousands of years, the trend was clear. The lowland populations thinned and disappeared. The mountain populations persisted. The animal that had once been a creature of warm, flat, dripping forest became by increments too slow to observe in any single lifetime. A creature of cold, steep, mist-wrapped mountains. And somewhere in that long contraction, the panda we recognize today took its final shape, larger than its pygmy ancestors, fully committed to bamboo, wearing the bold black and white pattern whose purpose still prompts quiet debate among researchers. Camouflage in snow and shadow, perhaps, or communication in dim forest light, or simply a feature that arose for reasons the fossil record is too incomplete to explain. What remains is the animal itself, the last living member of a genus that was once more various and more widespread, now confined to a handful of mountain ranges in central China, eating bamboo in the cold mist with the same patient thoroughness that its ancestors brought to the warm lowland forests of the Miocene. There is something deeply restful in that image, not melancholy, but simply true. Every living species is the distillation of an enormous history, a long funnel of time and selection and chance that narrows and narrows until only what remains actually remains. The giant panda carries 8 million years of that narrowing in its heavy jaw and its broad, calloused paws, in the false thumb that helps it grip bamboo stems, in the slow rhythm of its days. You too are a distillation, not of 8 million years perhaps, but of a lineage far longer than any single life can hold. Let that thought be a comfort rather than a weight. You come from something ancient and persistent, and right now, in this quiet moment, you are resting in it, as the panda rests in its cold forest, patient and unhurried, breathing slowly while the world turns around it. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the ground beneath you is not still. It is moving so slowly that no single human life could ever feel it, yet moving with the kind of patient, irresistible intention that only stone and deep time can muster. That is where this part of the story begins. Not with the panda itself, but with the land that called the panda into being. The mountains that rose so gradually and so grandly that entire species had millions of years to grow into the grooves the land carved for them. You are drifting now into a stillness older than almost anything you can name. And in that stillness, the world is quietly, endlessly building itself. Somewhere beneath you, two vast plates of ancient rock are pressing together. And that pressure, that slow, enormous, unhurrying pressure, is the reason the giant panda exists at all. Let that settle over you like warm air before sleep. The ground is breathing, and it has been breathing for 50 million years. Roughly 50 million years ago, a continent that we now call the Indian subcontinent, which had been adrift across a warm, ancient ocean for tens of millions of years before that, finally made contact with the southern edge of Eurasia. It did not crash in any dramatic, sudden way. There was no sound, no shudder you could have felt standing at the shore. It was more like two extraordinarily slow hands pressing together, and then continuing to press year after year, century after century, millennium upon millennium, without ever quite stopping. Today, India is still moving northward at roughly 5 centimeters per year. That is about the speed at which your fingernails grow, and yet accumulated across 50 million years, that patient creeping motion has produced the highest terrain on the surface of the planet. The Tibetan Plateau, which the panda's ancestors would eventually come to depend upon along its eastern margins, is the direct result of that collision. Crust that had nowhere to go but upward, folding and thickening until it rose into something vast and cold and sky-touching. You do not need to picture the drama of it. There was no drama, not in any human sense. There was only time and pressure and the slow obedience of rock. Feel that now as you breathe, the slow obedience of everything settling into its natural place. The Tibetan Plateau today sits at an average elevation of more than 4,000 meters above sea level, and it did not arrive there all at once. It rose in stages, lifted by the continuing collision below, the crust thickening the way a crumpled piece of cloth thickens when you push its two ends together. And along the plateau's eastern rim, something even more intricate was happening. Where the plateau's edge met the older, lower terrain of what is now Sichuan and Yunnan provinces in southwestern China, the land did not simply rise in a single clean escarpment. Instead, it fractured and folded into a tangle of deep gorges and high ridges, a corrugated, layered, endlessly complex landscape known today as the Hengduan Mountains. The name means, roughly, traversing and cutting, and it fits. These ranges run mostly north to south, which is itself unusual in a world where many great mountain chains run east to west. And between their ridges, the rivers carved passages so deep, they became some of the most dramatic gorges on the continent. The Yangtze River, which the Chinese know as the Changjiang, the Long River, cuts through this terrain. So does the Mekong, known in China as the Lancang, which will eventually flow south through Laos and Cambodia to the sea. And the Salween, the Nu in Chinese, runs parallel to both of them for hundreds of kilometers before angling away toward Myanmar and the Gulf of Martaban. These three great rivers run close enough together in places that you could, on a clear day from a high ridge, look out and see all three valley systems stretching before you. And yet each river drains into a different ocean basin. That is the kind of complexity the Hengduan Mountains created. Proximity and isolation braided together. Valleys so deep and ridges so high that the climate on one slope bore little resemblance to the climate on the slope facing the other way. And that complexity, that texture of difference compressed into a small geographic space, is part of what made this region one of the most biologically diverse temperate zones on the planet. Picture the western windward slopes of the Hengduan Ranges as the monsoon pushes moisture northward and westward from the Bay of Bengal and the South China Sea. The clouds pile against the ridges, cool as they rise, and release their water as rain in the warmer months, as snow in the cold ones. The soil stays damp, the forest floor stays shadowed, and in that cool, moist shadow, bamboo grows with a quiet, almost unthinking abundance. Dozens of species of it, spreading in dense undergrowth beneath the canopy, covering hillside after hillside in a deep, rustling green that barely changes from season to season, because bamboo is evergreen, patient, and remarkably good at enduring cold. Bamboo does not need warmth to thrive. It needs moisture and shade, and the kind of slow, reliable accumulation of leaf litter and forest soil that the Hengduan landscape provided over millions of years. This is the pantry that the panda's evolution would eventually require, and the mountains were already stocking it long before any bare ancestor arrived to discover it. Through the Miocene epoch, which lasted from roughly 23 million years ago to about 5 million years ago, the Hengduan Mountains continued rising. And through the Pliocene, which followed, they rose still more. The valleys deepened as rivers cut downward, while the ridges between them lifted. The climate gradients between high and low, wet and dry, north-facing and south-facing, grew steeper and more defined. A world of microclimates developed. Small pockets of habitat, each with its own temperature range and moisture regime, each becoming a crucible for the evolution of something slightly different. This is one of the reasons the Hengduan region is sometimes called a biodiversity hotspot, because the fragmentation of habitat by ridge and gorge acted over millions of years like a slow, patient experiment in speciation, separating populations just long enough and just thoroughly enough to allow new forms to emerge. You are resting now in a landscape that is the product of that patient experiment. A landscape still mid-experiment, still in process, still rising even now. Let the thought be gentle rather than vertiginous. The mountains under the panda's feet are geologically young. They have not finished becoming what they will be. They are, in some sense, still in the early chapters of their own story. And there is something quietly comforting about that, about the idea that immensity and becoming are not opposites, that the largest and most enduring things are also the ones most patiently in the middle of their own slow unfolding. There is another mountain range you should know about, because the panda's world is not entirely a Sichuan and Yunnan story. Far to the northeast of the Hengduan Ranges, running roughly east to west across central China, lies the Qinling Range, a separate chain of mountains that forms a kind of climatic and biological wall between northern and southern China, and it created its own bamboo-filled refuges in its southern-facing valleys. Panda populations that found their way into the Qinling Mountains were, over hundreds of thousands of years, cut off from the panda populations further south and west. The Qinling subspecies, and it is now recognized as a distinct subspecies, Ailuropoda melanoleuca qinlingensis, developed subtle differences in skull shape, in the proportions of its coloring, in the particular bamboo species it relied upon. It is a living record of what happens when a mountain range becomes a gentle wall between two worlds, not so impassable as to prevent the original colonization, but high and cold enough to prevent easy movement back and forth. Once the populations separated, the mountain was the sculptor. The panda was the clay, slowly taking the mountain's shape over time. Breathe with that for a moment. The idea that a ridge of stone, rising so slowly over so many millions of years, could reach into the body of an animal and quietly revise it, shaping the curve of its jaw, the depth of its eye socket, the particular food it would choose on a cold winter morning. The mountains do not know they are doing this. They are simply rising. The bamboo does not know it is feeding a lineage. It is simply growing. And the panda does not know it is the product of 50 million years of continental collision, of rivers cutting downward while ridges lifted upward, of monsoon moisture caught against western slopes and held there in a green permanence. It simply exists, exactly where and how it was shaped to exist. There is a particular quality to the air in the high bamboo forests of Sichuan, cool and faintly green-smelling even in midwinter, heavy with the vegetable sweetness of damp bamboo stems and old leaf litter. Imagine breathing that air now, slowly, through the particular stillness of a high-altitude forest at dusk, when the light goes silver and the bamboo stems take on a pale glow against the darker shadows between them. The ground under the bamboo is soft with accumulated years of leaf fall and decomposed matter. The temperature is dropping, but gently. Somewhere in the middle distance, the sound of a small stream running over rounded stones, water that fell as snow on a ridge thousands of meters above, and has been making its way down through the stone and soil for weeks, arriving here cool and clear and tasting faintly of the mountain. This is the world that the slow collision of continents built. This is the world that the Hengduan ridges and the Qinling walls enclosed and sheltered. And it is the world into which the panda's ancestors wandered, perhaps 8 or 9 million years ago in some early form, and then more decisively 2 to 3 million years ago as the climate shifted and bamboo forests consolidated into the broad, reliable undergrowth that could sustain a large animal eating almost nothing else. The mountains made the climate made the bamboo made the panda's possibility, and the panda, patient and slow-moving as the mountains themselves, simply stayed. You are drifting now, following the unhurried logic of deep time. The way everything that exists is the product of everything that came before it, stacked layer upon quiet layer, like the strata of stone in the walls of a river gorge. There is nothing to worry about in deep time. There is only the slow, reliable unfolding of cause into consequence. The way a continent moves 5 centimeters north each year, and 50 million years later, there are bamboo forests and giant black and white bears sleeping in them. The mountains are still rising. The Indian plate is still pressing northward, adding its 5 centimeters each year to a sum that has been accumulating since before our genus existed, before most mammal families existed, before the grass family had diversified enough to produce the bamboos that the panda depends on. Each century, the Hengduan ridges rise a little more, measurably, detectably, if you have the instruments and the patience. The gorges of the Yangtze and the Mekong and the Salween are a little deeper. The climate gradients are a little steeper. The experiment continues, and somewhere in those cool, moist valleys, in the deep green undergrowth of a bamboo thicket on a windward slope in Sichuan, a panda is sitting in the way that pandas sit, unhurried, deliberate, wholly present to the task of eating. And beneath it, without any fuss, the ground is still very slowly, very patiently, still becoming. Settle into the quiet for a moment and let yourself imagine the smell of green, that cool, faintly sweet, almost mineral scent that rises from a dense stand of bamboo after rain, when the hollow culms are beaded with moisture and the broad leaves hang perfectly still in the mountain air. That smell is ancient. It carries within it a story that begins not in the high Sichuan valleys you might picture when you think of pandas, but in a much warmer, much stranger world that existed tens of millions of years before any bear-like creature ever reached for a stalk. To understand why a giant panda spends most of its waking life eating grass, and that is precisely what bamboo is, a grass, you need to travel back through deep time to an era when the continents were still finding their current arrangement, and the planet's forests were slowly, quietly beginning to open. Bamboo belongs to the family Poaceae, the great grass family, the same sprawling botanical lineage that would eventually give the world wheat and rice and the savanna grasses that rustle beneath African skies. The earliest grasses appear in the fossil record in the Eocene, roughly 50 to 34 million years ago. And through that long, warm epoch, and into the cooler, drier Oligocene that followed, grasses were spreading quietly into the spaces that dense tropical forest left behind. As the climate shifted and dried, as mountain ranges rose and altered rainfall patterns, as the world slowly exhaled warmth and drew in something crisper and more seasonal, gaps opened in the ancient tree canopy. Into those gaps, grasses moved. And among those early grasses, the ancestors of bamboo were already experimenting with what would become their most extraordinary trait: the capacity to grow with almost reckless speed and to build towering woody culms from nothing more than sunlight, water, and the thin mountain soil. By the time the Himalayan uplift was accelerating and the landscape of what is now southwest China was being creased and folded into the ridges and valleys of Sichuan, bamboo was ready. It did not need deep soil. It did not need a long establishment period. It grew and it spread, and it created something the mountain forest had not quite had before: a dense, continuous green understory that reached from the ground to head height and beyond, a second layer of living structure beneath the canopy of fir and spruce and larch. In the valleys of Sichuan today, two genera of bamboo dominate the places where pandas live. There is arrow bamboo, known to botanists as Fargesia, a smaller and more delicate plant with slender culms and narrow leaves that grows in dense thickets at higher elevations, often above 2,000 meters, where winter brings snow and the air is thin and cold. And there is umbrella bamboo, broader and taller and slightly more robust, filling the middle elevations in green masses so thick that a person moving through them must push the culms aside with both arms, and even then the path closes behind like water. Standing at the edge of such a thicket and looking in, you have the sensation of looking into something genuinely impenetrable. A green darkness that seems to swallow sound, where the light filters through in pale shifting columns, and the ground beneath is layered deep with fallen leaves and the papery sheaths that culms shed as they mature. This is the understory that giant pandas have organized their entire existence around. But here is where the story takes a turn that is, if you let yourself feel it, quietly astonishing. Bamboo is not a generous food. It is not rich or easily digested. It is, in terms of nutrition, one of the least rewarding plants a large mammal could choose to eat. The culms and leaves are composed almost entirely of cellulose, the structural carbohydrate that locks carbon into plant cell walls, and silica, the same mineral that gives glass its hardness and that exists in bamboo in quantities high enough to wear down teeth over a lifetime of chewing. A panda's digestive system's ancestrally carnivorous. The gut is short and simple, designed by evolution to process meat, not to ferment and break down tough plant fibers. There are no specialized stomach chambers, none of the complex microbial machinery that cattle or deer or other dedicated herbivores carry. The cellulose passes through mostly intact. What the panda can extract from each mouthful of bamboo is surprisingly little. Estimates suggest that a panda may actually absorb and use only a small fraction of the raw calories it consumes, and so the animal eats. It eats for 12 hours a day, sometimes longer. It eats sitting down, reclining against a slope or a tree trunk, pulling stalks toward itself with that extraordinary modified wrist bone, the so-called false thumb, an enlarged radial sesamoid that acts as a sixth digit, and stripping leaves or splitting culms with practiced efficiency. The sound of a panda eating bamboo is a slow, rhythmic crunching, like someone taking their time with something that requires patience, which is precisely what it does require, and what the panda offers in abundance. It eats not because the food is good, but because it must eat an enormous quantity of something mediocre in order to survive. In a high mountain valley in Sichuan, a panda may consume 20 kilograms or more of bamboo stems and leaves in a single day. And all of that eating, all of that patient, unhurried consumption, produces only enough usable energy to keep a relatively sedentary animal alive at altitude. The panda has not optimized itself for bamboo so much as it has committed to it, deeply, irreversibly, over hundreds of thousands of years. And now its skeleton and its muscles and its false thumb and its peculiarly thick jaw muscles are all evidence of that commitment, written in bone and tissue, and then on timescales that make even the panda's evolutionary commitment seem brief. Bamboo does something remarkable. It flowers, not continuously, not seasonally, but in great synchronized pulses separated by decades. 50 years, 80 years, 100 years, sometimes 120 years between one flowering and the next. An entire species of bamboo, every individual of that species across its whole geographic range, will flower simultaneously, produce seeds in an extraordinary burst of reproductive effort, and then die. The bamboo does not wilt gradually. It does not thin out over years. It flowers, sets seed, and then the culms brown and collapse, the leaves fall, and what was a dense living thicket becomes, within a season or two, a tangle of dry grey stalks standing in silence. This is called mass seeding, and it happens across the plant kingdom in various forms. Beech trees do something similar, as do certain oaks and some conifers. But in bamboo, the phenomenon is taken to an extreme. The synchrony is almost perfect, and the die-off is total. Stand in a bamboo forest the year after a mass seeding event, and you stand in something that looks like the aftermath of a slow fire. Not burnt, but exhausted, emptied, the living green replaced by a pale and brittle skeleton that crumbles when you touch it. For a panda living in a mountain valley, where one species of bamboo dominates, a mass seeding event is a crisis of the first order. The food simply disappears, not reduced, not thinned, gone. And this is where the deep time geography of the Sichuan Mountains becomes essential to the story. In a landscape of connected ridges and valleys, a panda ancestor experiencing a bamboo die-off in one valley could move. The mountain ranges of southwest China, folded and lifted over millions of years by the same tectonic forces that raised the Himalayas, created a terrain of parallel ridges separated by river valleys, and across that terrain, different bamboo species, Fargesia nitida and Fargesia scabrida, and their relatives, did not all follow the same flowering calendar. A ridge away, or two ridges away, another species might be in the full green density of its vegetative phase, decades from its own next flowering. The panda ancestors who survived were the ones who could navigate that landscape, who knew, in whatever way an animal knows such things, through memory or through following others, or through the simple pressure of hunger leading them upslope and over a pass and down into a new valley, that elsewhere the bamboo was still standing. Corridors mattered, connectivity mattered. The web of mountains and forests that allowed movement between stands was not just habitat. It was, in the deepest sense, survival infrastructure. Today, when conservationists work to protect and restore habitat for giant pandas, they speak often of corridors, of linking isolated forest patches so that pandas can move between them. That concern is not new. It echoes something that shaped the panda's lineage across millions of years. The fundamental need to be able to walk from one stand of grass to another when the one you depended on has flowered and died and gone quiet. The new seeds that a mass-seeding bamboo leaves behind will germinate and grow, slowly, over the years and decades that follow. The forest floor after a die-off is not empty. It is seeded, literally, with the next generation. And in time, the thickets will return, green and dense and slow rustling in the mountain wind. But that return takes longer than any individual panda's life. And so the strategy was never to wait, but always to move, to carry the knowledge of the mountains in the body, to follow the green. You can feel something of that deep, patient logic when you picture a panda sitting in a thicket in the early morning, the mist still caught in the valley below, and the higher peaks invisible above the cloud, pulling one stalk after another toward its broad face, and eating with the unhurried concentration of an animal that has no other pressing business in the world The bamboo surrounds it on all sides, each culm a product of millions of years of grass evolution, of continents shifting and climates cooling and forest opening, and an ancient lineage finding its way into the mountain understory and staying there. The panda chews, the fog drifts. Somewhere far below, the river carries snowmelt toward the lowlands, and the forest holds its slow breath, and the morning moves at exactly the pace it has always moved at, which is to say, gently and without hurry, and with all the time in the world. There is a particular quality of stillness that settles over a mountainside bamboo grove in the early morning, when the mist has not yet lifted, and the green stalks stand so close together that the light comes through them in soft, diffuse columns, like light through cathedral glass. And somewhere in that quiet, if you are patient enough, you might hear the faint, rhythmic sound of something chewing, slow, methodical, unhurried, a sound that has been present in these mountains for millions of years, long before the forests looked the way they look today, long before the particular arrangement of peaks and valleys that we now call home to the giant panda had settled into its current shape. That sound, that steady, patient chewing, is the sound of one of the most quietly astonishing evolutionary stories on Earth. A story written not in dramatic leaps, but in slow, almost imperceptible adjustments, in small shifts that accumulated across vast stretches of deep time, until a creature whose entire body was built for one way of living found itself, generation by generation, committed to something else entirely. The giant panda is, by every measure that biology has, a carnivore. Its digestive system is short and simple. The gut of an animal designed to process meat efficiently, to extract nutrition quickly from dense animal tissue and move it through with speed. There is no long fermentation chamber, no complex multi-chambered stomach, none of the elaborate digestive architecture that a ruminant uses to wring energy from plant matter over many hours of careful processing. The panda's gut looks, functionally, like the gut of a bear who has just eaten a salmon, not like the gut of an animal whose entire existence depends on one of the most nutritionally dilute food sources available in a temperate forest. And yet, here it is, this carnivore, sitting in the bamboo with both hands full, eating. Because the gut cannot compensate with efficient extraction, the panda compensates with time. Somewhere in the range of 14 hours out of every 24 are spent eating, not because the panda is greedy or restless, but because the mathematics of survival demand it. The dry matter absorption rate from bamboo is thought to be somewhere around 17%, perhaps a little more, perhaps a little less, depending on the part of the plant and the season. And 17% is, by any reckoning, an extraordinarily modest return on 14 hours of daily labor. A cow, with its elaborate fermentation system, can extract far more from grass. A panda, with the gut of a meat-eater pressed into vegetarian service, must simply eat more and eat longer, and accept that much of what passes through will pass through without yielding much at all. This is not failure. This is adaptation doing what adaptation does, finding a path that works well enough, that tips the balance towards survival and reproduction, even if it is not elegant, even if it is not the solution an engineer would have designed from scratch. Evolution does not design from scratch. It works with what is already there, and what was already there in the panda's ancestors was a carnivore's body. And so, you find yourself imagining the panda's daily rhythm. The long, slow hours of eating, the careful selection of bamboo shoots or leaves or culms depending on the season, the almost meditative quality of that sustained, unhurried chewing. and you realize that what looks like a life of leisure is actually a life of almost continuous nutritional effort, and that the calm is not ease but necessity, because any expenditure of energy beyond what is absolutely required is energy that cannot be afforded. Resting is eating's partner. The two together form the entire shape of a panda's day, and both are expressions of the same underlying constraint, a body asking more of a food source than that food source easily gives. Now bring your attention gently to the panda's hands, because here the story takes one of its most remarkable turns. Hold in your mind the image of a panda gripping a bamboo stalk. The way it wraps those broad, dark paws around the stem with what looks unmistakably like a grip, like something deliberate and precise, something that has the appearance of the kind of grasping that primates do. What you are seeing is the famous false thumb, and it is worth taking a moment to let the full strangeness of it settle over you. The panda has 5 fingers, as bears do, and those 5 fingers cannot oppose each other. There is no true opposable thumb the way a human hand has one, but extending from the wrist, positioned just so, there is an enlarged radial sesamoid bone, a wrist bone that in most carnivores is small and unremarkable, serving modest structural purposes in the architecture of the forelimb. In the panda, this bone has become something else. Over millions of years, it enlarged. It shifted in its positioning. It developed the muscular attachments needed to move in a way that creates, functionally, something very like opposition, a 6th grip point that works against the 5 fingers to let the panda hold a bamboo stem with a precision and control that its carnivore forebears never needed and never had. The evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould wrote about the panda's thumb at length, using it as one of his most elegant examples of imperfection as evidence for evolution. Because if a designer were creating an optimal bamboo-eating animal, they would not start with a carnivore's wrist and modify a sesamoid bone. They would give the animal a proper thumb. The fact that the panda's grip is built from a repurposed wrist bone, that it is a workaround rather than an optimal solution, is precisely what makes it such a clear window into how evolution actually operates. It finds what is available in the existing structure and modifies it, incrementally, across time so deep we can barely comprehend it, until something that barely served one function becomes surprisingly competent at another. And that modified wrist bone, that elegant imperfection, lets the panda strip leaves from a bamboo stem with a delicacy that seems almost incongruous with the animal's size. And it has been doing so for long enough that we now think of the false thumb as one of the panda's defining features, as characteristic as the black eye patches or the roly-poly outline that makes the animal seem so inherently, almost unreasonably, appealing to the human eye. There is another layer to this evolutionary story, one that lives not in the bones or the gut, but in the genome, in the quiet language of genes, some of which are speaking, and some of which have, over the long millennia, simply gone silent. Among the things that define a carnivore at a molecular level is a particular suite of taste receptors, and chief among the receptors relevant to a meat-eating life is one that detects umami, that savory, protein-rich flavor that signals the presence of amino acids, that tells a predator's brain that what is in the mouth is good, is nourishing, is worth pursuing. The gene responsible for a key component of this receptor is called T1R1. And in most meat-eating mammals, it is functional, active, producing the receptor protein that makes umami taste like umami. In the giant panda, T1R1 is a pseudogene. It has accumulated mutations that have rendered it non-functional. a stretch of DNA that still has the recognizable shape of a gene, that still carries the echoes of the thing it used to be, but that no longer produces a working protein, no longer sends a signal, no longer tells the panda's brain anything at all about the savory taste of meat. The panda, in other words, cannot taste umami, the flavor that most strongly marks food as animal protein, the flavor that, for most carnivores, makes meat taste like meat, is invisible to the panda's palate. This is not the reason the panda eats bamboo, but it may be part of the reason it does not return to meat even when meat is theoretically available, even when the gut that processes it would, in strict terms, handle it more efficiently than bamboo. The loss of T1R1 function appears in the genetic record in a time frame that suggests it happened gradually, accumulating over the same long span, during which the panda was shifting its diet, each mutation harmless or nearly so in an animal that was already eating less and less meat, each small change reinforcing the direction that other pressures were already pushing. This is how evolution often works, not as a single decisive moment, but as a convergence of small shifts, each individually modest, together amounting to something profound, and in retrospect, looking almost like intention. And this brings us to the deepest layer of the story, the one that reaches back into the Miocene, that epoch of warm climates and spreading grasslands and shifting forests that lasted from roughly 23 million years to 5 million years ago, a time when the ancestors of modern bears were already present, already diversifying, already exploring different ecological niches in the forests and open lands of what would become Asia. The leading hypothesis for why panda ancestors began their shift toward plant eating, and specifically toward bamboo, involves something familiar: ecological pressure, the kind that arises when the landscape changes, when the reliable things become unreliable, when competition intensifies or prey becomes scarce. In the Miocene, shifts in climate and vegetation would have altered the distribution of prey animals, and it is plausible, the evidence is incomplete, as it always is when we reach this far back, that some populations of early panda ancestors found themselves in circumstances where animal prey was harder to find, where the energetic cost of hunting outweighed the return, where something else was abundant and available, even if it required significant adjustment to exploit. Bamboo is many things. It is not, on the face of it, an obvious answer to the problem of what to eat when meat is scarce. It is low in nutrition, difficult to digest with a carnivore's gut, and requires considerable behavioral and anatomical innovation to handle efficiently. But it is also remarkably abundant. It grows in dense stands that can persist through climatic variation that would devastate other food sources, and crucially, it does not run away. For an animal making a transition under pressure, bamboo's reliability may have outweighed its nutritional poverty, and over generations, thousands of generations, tens of thousands, the numbers blurring into abstraction when you try to hold them clearly. The ancestors that happened to be slightly better at extracting value from bamboo, slightly better at holding stems, slightly less dependent on the taste of meat for motivation, left slightly more offspring, and those offspring inherited the slight advantages, and the advantages compounded, and the generations accumulated. And here we are, millions of years later, in the misty bamboo forest, listening to that steady, patient chewing. Evolution does not plan. This is perhaps the most important thing to carry with you as you rest in the quiet of the bamboo grove, as you let the facts settle and soften into something that feels more like understanding than like information. There was no moment when the panda's ancestors decided to become what the panda is now. There was no foresight, no intention, no blueprint. there was only the slow filtering of what worked from what did not, played out across time so long that even our best attempts to comprehend it tend to dissolve into metaphor. The panda's body is a palimpsest, that word for a manuscript that has been scraped clean and written over, but where the old writing still shows through beneath the new. The carnivore is still there, in the short gut, in the bone structure of the wrist that was repurposed rather than replaced, in the pseudogene that still carries the ghost of the umami receptor. The new writing is there too, in the enlarged sesamoid, in the behavioral commitment to 14 hours of daily bamboo consumption, in the genomic evidence of a palate that has, quietly and over immense time, let go of one world and settled into another. And what is the panda then, if you try to sum it up? It is a carnivore living a herbivore's life, using a wrist bone as a thumb, tasting bamboo with a palate that no longer registers the flavor that once defined its kind, absorbing perhaps 17% of what it eats, and spending more than half of every day eating to make up the difference. It is a creature that evolution has written and rewritten, that carries its history in its body the way old manuscripts carry their previous texts, and it sits in the bamboo grove with the mist around it and the green light coming through the stems. And it chews, slowly, methodically, in a way that has the quality of deep time made audible, the sound of millions of years of small adjustments arriving at last at this particular, improbable, quietly wonderful moment. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the smell of wet stone and green moss rising from a forested mountainside, the air cool enough to raise the faintest chill along your forearms, clouds drifting so low and so slowly through the trees that you could almost reach out and pull a handful toward you like loose cotton. This is the world the giant panda has called home for millions of years. A vertical world, layered and alive, tucked into the folded ranges of central China's Sichuan province, where the land rises dramatically from subtropical valleys into sky-touching alpine meadows, and where the weather is rarely anything but soft, grey and damp. It is one of the most biologically rich and least visited places on Earth, and it belongs, in a very particular way, to the panda. Settle yourself somewhere comfortable. Let your breath slow. Let the image build slowly, like mist rising from a cold stream at the edge of dawn. The Minshan and Qionglai mountain ranges are the panda's true homeland. They are ancient ranges by any measure, part of the broader Hengduan system that began lifting and folding roughly 50 million years ago as the Indian subcontinent pressed northward into the Asian plate, crumpling the landscape the way a cloth wrinkles when you push two edges toward one another. The result is a landscape of extraordinary relief. Valleys that drop into warm, humid subtropical air below 2,000 meters, where broadleaf forests grow dense and layered and dripping with ferns, and where the temperature rarely falls far enough to bring frost. These lower valleys are lush, almost heavy in their greenness, the canopy so full that the ground below lives in perpetual green shadow, the air thick with the sound of running water over rocks, worn smooth over centuries. But the panda does not spend its life here, not most of it. It is a creature of the middle world, the elevational band between roughly 2,000 meters and 3,500 meters, where the forest changes character entirely. Here, the subtropical broadleaf trees thin out and give way to something altogether cooler and more austere. Mixed forests of silver fir and spruce, interspersed with stands of birch and maple that flush gold and amber in the short autumn weeks, and beneath them, always the bamboo. Rhododendrons crowd the understory, and in late spring they bloom in shades of deep pink and pale cream and dusty white, their flowers opening in slow succession as the warmth climbs the mountain, so that the entire hillside seems to flower in waves, week by week, moving steadily upward like a slow tide. The panda moves through this world at its own unhurried pace, pausing to eat, resting against a mossy trunk, shifting a few hundred meters through the trees when the mood takes it. Above 3,500 meters, the trees begin to thin and stoop, stunted by wind and cold, and eventually the forest gives way entirely to open alpine meadows. These high meadows are carpeted in low grasses and sedges and small flowering plants that bloom fiercely in the brief warm months. And above 4,000 meters, the land is often swept bare, rocky, cold even in midsummer. A world that even the panda only briefly visits during its seasonal wanderings. The panda's year is governed by a gentle rhythm of vertical migration, a slow pulse of movement up and down the mountain as the seasons turn. In winter, when snow lies heavy on the high slopes and the temperature at altitude drops well below freezing, the panda drifts gradually downward, following the warmer, more sheltered valleys where bamboo, though slower growing and less tender in the cold months, remains accessible through the snow. The lower reaches of the mountain offer a kind of refuge, less wind, slightly warmer nights, denser canopy to hold what warmth there is. The panda does not hibernate, not truly. Unlike a bear denning through the darkest months, the panda remains active through winter, feeding for hours each day to maintain its energy, its thick fur holding warmth against the cold air. And so it persists through the cold months, moving slowly through a quiet, muffled forest where snow deadens all sound and the light is soft and grey. Then, as spring loosens its grip on the high slopes and the snow begins to retreat uphill, the panda follows. The driving force is bamboo. The bamboo species that grow at higher elevations send up fresh shoots in spring and early summer. And these tender new growths are the richest, most nutritious part of the plant. Water-filled, soft enough to require less of the panda's enormous jaw muscles, concentrated in the energy and protein that a large animal relying on such a fibrous food source desperately needs. And so the panda climbs, unhurried but purposeful, moving higher as the season progresses, pausing on a south-facing slope to eat through a patch of young shoots, then resting in the shade of a fir grove while the afternoon clouds build and the temperature cools. This is what the panda's year looks like from the inside. A long, slow, vertical journey made in both directions, season by season, with eating and resting, and the occasional languid exploration filling almost every hour. Cloud and mist are as fundamental to this landscape as the stone beneath it. The Sichuan Basin to the east is one of the foggiest, most moisture-laden regions in China, and the mountain ranges that frame it on the west act as a great barrier against which weather systems stall and unravel. Moisture-laden air from the Pacific pushes inland, rises as it encounters the mountains, cools, and condenses into the perpetual grey overcast that defines the Sichuan climate. Even on summer days when the valleys below bake in heat, the panda's cloud forest is likely wrapped in mist, the air soft and close, visibility shortening to a few dozen meters between the trees. This is not unpleasant. It is, in fact, deeply atmospheric, the kind of weather that softens every edge and muffles every sound and makes the world feel enclosed and intimate, as though you are moving through something private and apart from the usual concerns of ordinary time. Water beads on every surface. Bamboo leaves catch droplets that gather at the tip and fall in slow, irregular rhythms. Moss on the north-facing rocks is so saturated, it would squeeze like a sponge between your fingers. The soil, deep and dark and rich in the decayed matter of centuries of fallen leaves, holds moisture long after the rain has stopped, releasing it slowly upward into the air as the temperature drops at dusk. Breathe it in, that imagined air, cool, green, ancient. The panda shares this cloud forest with a community of other animals, each one finding its own niche in the vertical world. The red panda, smaller and more nimble, its russet coat almost glowing in the grey light, climbs readily into the branches of fir trees where it rests during the warmer hours of the day, coming down at dusk and dawn to forage for bamboo leaves and berries and small insects. It and the giant panda are not closely related despite their shared name and overlapping habitat. The resemblance in diet and dwelling is a remarkable case of convergent adaptation. Two animals from entirely different lineages arriving at similar solutions to the same landscape. High in the canopy, the golden snub-nosed monkey moves in noisy, sociable troops, their vivid blue faces and thick golden fur incongruously bright in the muted forest. They are vocal and energetic, leaping between branches with a confidence that seems impossible given the height and the wet, the moss-slick surfaces underfoot. But they have been doing exactly this for far longer than any current observer has been alive to watch them. Their calls carry a long way through the mist, a sound that belongs to this landscape as completely as the dripping water or the wind in the high firs. Below, in the denser undergrowth, moving with a patience and deliberateness that mirrors the panda's own unhurried tempo, the clouded leopard hunts. It is a forest ghost, spotted and dappled to near invisibility in the play of dim light through layered leaves, its oversized paws moving silently over wet ground. The clouded leopard is one of the most skilled arboreal hunters in the world, capable of descending tree trunks headfirst with a grip so secure it almost defies what you would expect of an animal of its size. And it is rarely seen even by people who know exactly where to look. And through the higher meadows and forest edges roams the takin, a large, heavy, unusual-looking animal that resembles something between a goat and a muskox, golden or tawny in the light, when the cloud breaks briefly and sun reaches the slopes. Takin are gregarious and bold, moving in herds through the bamboo thickets and upslope into the meadows, their broad hooves finding purchase on ground that would challenge a human climber. They are part of the same living community the panda inhabits, fellow travelers in the vertical mountain world, each contributing to the intricate web of presence and movement and foraging that keeps the cloud forest alive through the centuries. Night in the panda's forest arrives with a particular quality of stillness. The temperature drops quickly after sunset in these mountains, sometimes by 10 or 12 degrees Celsius within the space of a couple of hours, and the moisture in the air, already high, condenses further onto every surface. Bamboo culms, already gleaming with the day's collected mist, are now beaded so thickly with dew that they glitter faintly in whatever thin starlight manages to filter through the overcast. The sounds of the forest shift. Daytime birds settle and quiet. The wind that sometimes moves through the upper canopy in the afternoon dies back, and the forest falls into a hush that is not quite silence. There is always the small sound of water somewhere, the creak of a branch cooling and contracting, the distant call of a nightjar or a small owl working the dark between the trees. The panda rests between its long feeding bouts. It is not a particularly territorial sleeper. It may recline against a mossy log, or wedge itself comfortably between the root buttresses of a large fir, or simply settle where it is, on the cool ground, its round head resting on its paws, its thick fur shedding the dew as the night deepens. It may feed again in the early hours before dawn, when the bamboo is at its coldest and most dew-laden, pulling shoots toward its mouth with those distinctive pseudo-thumbs, chewing with a slow, methodical rhythm that has not changed in any essential way for millions of years. You are, in some ways, not so different from this animal in your most elemental needs: warmth, food, rest, a safe and bounded place to be still. The panda asks nothing of its mountain beyond those things. It does not require speed or territory or confrontation. It requires bamboo, cool air, high ground, and enough time to eat and rest and move at its own unhurried pace through a landscape that has held and sheltered its kind since long before any human set foot in these mountains. And now, in this imagined moment, you are resting somewhere inside that same ancient rhythm. The clouds are drifting low through the fir trees. The bamboo is beaded with cold dew. The forest is quiet, and the mountain holds everything in a cool, mist-grey stillness. Let it hold you too for a little while. The panda you left resting at the close of the last passage is still there, somewhere in the dark between the fir trees, breathing slowly, a dense and quiet presence tucked into the mountain night. And here, in that image of a single animal at ease in all that vast and silent terrain, is perhaps the most important truth about the giant panda's inner life. It is by nature alone, not lonely in any sense we would recognize, not waiting for company or searching for the warmth of others, but genuinely, contentedly, constitutionally solitary. This is the shape of panda existence, and it has been this way for a very long time. Each adult panda occupies a home range that stretches across somewhere between 4 and 15 square kilometers of mountain forest, a territory measured not in straight lines, but in slopes and ridges, and the particular distribution of the bamboo patches that sustain it. Within that range, the panda moves according to its own unhurried calendar, and it rarely encounters another of its kind. Days pass in the rhythm of eating and resting and eating again. Weeks turn over quietly. The mist comes and lifts and comes again. And the panda is, in all of this, sufficient to itself. There is something worth sitting with in that idea. The sufficiency of a creature that needs so little company, that carries its whole life within the boundaries of a few familiar valleys, and knows every boulder and every leaning trunk, and every seasonal flush of arrow bamboo as intimately as any creature can know a place it has never left. The panda is not a wanderer, it is a dweller, and the world it dwells in is written not in sights and sounds so much as in something far more ancient and precise: scent. Lean close to a mossy rock at the edge of a panda's range, and you would find nothing remarkable, nothing visible to the eye. But to another panda passing days or even weeks later, that rock is a document, a detailed and layered account of who has been here when and in what condition. The giant panda possesses a specialized scent gland beneath its tail, producing a waxy, complex secretion that it applies with deliberate care to trees, bamboo stems, rocks, and the bare earth of well-worn paths. The animal will reverse up against a vertical surface, pressing the gland firmly to the bark or stone, sometimes performing a slow handstand against a tree trunk to mark as high as its raised body will reach. The higher the mark, the more imposing the implied animal. And pandas do seem to stretch and strain for height when they scent mark, a kind of olfactory architecture, building a presence in the forest that is taller than the creature itself. What the secretion contains is a chemical autobiography. Researchers studying the composition of panda scent marks have found that these waxy messages encode information about the individual's identity, its sex, its reproductive status, and its age. A passing panda can read all of this without ever making direct contact, can know whether the animal who passed this way was male or female, whether a female was approaching or already past the narrow window of fertility, whether a rival or a potential mate had moved through recently. It is a form of communication perfectly suited to a solitary life. Asynchronous, persistent, information dense. You do not need to meet in order to know. You do not need to be present to speak. The forest becomes a kind of slow correspondence. Messages left and read across days and distances. A conversation conducted in chemistry rather than sound. And it works. Across the quiet months of autumn and winter, these messages accumulate and fade and are renewed, building a picture of who lives where, whose range overlaps with whose, who is large and who is young, and who has been moving through a territory that is not quite their own. The pandas never need to confront this information directly. They absorb it in passing, pausing at a marked stone for long, thoughtful moments. Their broad, flat faces press close, nostrils working. They are reading, and then they move on. But there is one season when the quiet correspondence of scent becomes something more urgent, when the slow, solitary calendar of panda life is interrupted by a brief and singular intensity. In the heart of spring, usually between March and May, female pandas enter estrus. The window is startlingly small, somewhere between 1 and 3 days during which conception is possible, a period so brief in the context of an entire year that it seems almost improbable, a narrow gate in a long wall. In the weeks approaching this window, the chemical messages in the forest change. Females mark more frequently, their secretions shifting in composition, broadcasting a signal that travels outward through the trees in every direction. Males, whose ranges typically overlap with those of several females, begin to move differently, covering more ground, checking marks more carefully, sometimes calling out with a vocabulary of bleats and moans and chirps that carries surprisingly far through the still mountain air. For a brief and vivid interval, the solitary panda becomes a social creature, or something approaching one. Males may converge on a female's territory, and where they meet one another, they posture and contest, though rarely with serious violence, more a matter of presence and persistence, of who holds their ground and who withdraws. The female herself is selective, and her choices, even in this compressed and pressured window, appear to be genuinely her own. And then it is over. The males disperse back into their separate ranges. The forest settles. The scent marks return to their slower register. And inside the female panda, something extraordinary and ancient begins to unfold, or rather, to wait, because if fertilization occurs, the resulting embryo does not immediately implant in the uterine wall and begin its development. Instead, it floats, suspended, in a state of biological pause known as delayed implantation. The fertilized egg drifts for weeks or even months, held in a kind of developmental suspension, while the mother's body continues its ordinary life, eating bamboo, resting in the cool shade of the high forest, accumulating the fat and condition that will eventually be needed. Only when the body is ready, when the season has turned and the conditions are right, does the embryo finally implant and begin the rapid growth that will produce a cub. This is not unique to pandas. Delayed implantation is found across the bear family and in a number of other mammals, a strategy that decouples the timing of mating from the timing of birth, allowing animals to mate when partners can be found and give birth when conditions favor survival. But there is something quietly remarkable about it nonetheless. This pause at the very beginning of a life, this unhurried beginning to an already unhurried existence. The cub, when it finally arrives, will be born after a gestation of roughly 95 to 160 days, though much of that time is the floating weight rather than active development. It will be tiny, pink, almost translucent, weighing perhaps 100 grams against its mother's 100 kilograms, one of the most dramatic size differentials between mother and newborn of any placental mammal. And the mother will cup it in her great paw with a tenderness that seems to surprise observers every time, holding it constantly, keeping it warm, producing rich milk that allows it to grow with improbable speed. But all of that is still to come. What we are sitting with now, in this passage, is the broader rhythm that contains all those particular moments, the slow time of the panda, the time measured not in days or even seasons, but in something deeper and longer. A panda's home range is negotiated not in a single season, but over years, worn into familiarity through repetition and return. A scent-marking tree may carry the chemical records of the same individual across an entire decade, each new mark layered over the fading traces of the last. The mating season comes and goes and comes again, and a female may raise only a handful of cubs across a lifetime of 15 or 20 years in the wild, each cub a years-long investment of attention and milk and patience. This is a creature calibrated for slowness, for depth, for the long view, and the long view, for the panda, extends back through time in a way that is worth pausing to feel. The genus Ailuropoda has been on these mountains, or mountains very much like them, for somewhere around 2 million years. The solitary ranging, the scent communication, the narrow mating window, the floating embryo. These are not recent adaptations. They are ancient solutions, tested across geological time, refined through uncountable generations of pandas moving through forests that have themselves shifted and changed and returned. The bamboo has changed. The climate has shifted. Glaciers advancing and retreating. The mountains themselves rising almost imperceptibly higher with each passing million years. But the panda's fundamental way of being has remained patient and precise. A way of life so well fitted to this particular niche that it has outlasted almost everything around it. Sit with that for a moment. A creature whose approach to solitude and communication and reproduction was already ancient before our own genus existed, carrying forward into the present a way of being that was already old when the first stone tools were being shaped. Panda time is not our time. It is slower, deeper, more patient than anything we live inside. And there is something in that slowness, that depth, that extraordinary patience, which is itself a kind of restfulness. The forest holds it, the mountain holds it, and somewhere in the dark between the firs, a panda settles more deeply into its own quiet existence, asking nothing of the night except that it continue, slow and cool and full of the green scent of bamboo. The bamboo forest breathes around you now, cool air settling through layered canopy, each leaf holding a bead of condensation that will not fall for a very long time. There is a stillness here that seems ancient, and it is. What you are feeling, without quite naming it, is the residue of deep geological time pressing up through the soil, through the root systems, into the slow rhythmic chewing of a panda who has no awareness of the vast history encoded in the curl of its chromosomes. The world was remade many times before this creature arrived at its present form, and the shape of that remaking is still visible. if you know how to look. In the narrow mountain corridors the panda occupies today, in the slight genetic differences between one population and another, in the particular bamboo species each population prefers. Tonight we are going to follow the panda backwards through roughly 2.5 million years of ice, and then let the long, warm present settle us gently back to sleep. The Pleistocene epoch began approximately 2.5 million years ago, and its defining quality was rhythm. Not the irregular rhythm of ecological disturbance, not the stochastic disruption of a single volcanic eruption or a single dry decade, but something far more measured and inexorable. A planetary breathing driven by subtle variations in the Earth's orbital path around the Sun, in the tilt of its axis, in the wobble of that tilt over time. These cycles, which astronomers and geologists call Milankovitch cycles, after the Serbian scientist who described their mathematics in the early 20th century, operate on timescales of roughly 40,000 to 100,000 years. At their cold extremes, ice sheets thickened and spread across the northern continents. Sea levels fell by as much as 120 meters as water was locked into glaciers, and the climatic zones of the planet compressed southward. At their warm peaks, the ice retreated, forests expanded, and creatures that had sheltered in isolated pockets of survivable habitat could pour back out across landscapes that were once again hospitable. For the panda lineage, this rhythm was not an abstraction. It was the pulse of their entire world. In the warmer intervals between glaciations, the interglacials, some of which were as warm as or warmer than our present climate, the ancestors of the giant panda moved across a range that would astonish anyone who knows only the living animals' narrow mountain corridors. Fossil Ailuropoda, the genus to which the giant panda belongs, have been recovered from sites scattered across an enormous swath of eastern and southern Asia. Specimens have been found in what is now Vietnam, far to the south of any panda habitat in human memory. They have been found in cave deposits near what is now Beijing, a city that sits in the temperate lowlands of northern China, a landscape that today has no bamboo forest of the kind the panda requires. They have been found across much of what is now southern China, Guangdong, Guangxi, Yunnan, provinces that carry no giant pandas today and have not for thousands of years. This was a creature of broad lowland and mid-elevation forest, an animal that could apparently tolerate a considerable range of conditions as long as bamboo was present and the winters were not so severe that the bamboo died back entirely. The interglacial world for panda ancestors was spacious. Then the ice returned. The transition from an interglacial into a full glacial maximum was not instantaneous by human standards, but it was swift by geological ones, unfolding over thousands of years, a slow tightening of cold that crept southward, compressing forest belts, killing bamboo at higher and lower elevations, shrinking the hospitable zone into isolated islands of survivable climate. The great flat lowlands of eastern China, which during warmer periods supported forests and bamboo understory, grew cold and dry, their soils blowing away in low storms, the vegetation shifting toward cold grassland and steppe. Panda populations that had spread across the lowlands found themselves stranded in fragments of remaining forest, cut off from one another by expanding bands of unsuitable habitat. This is what ecologists call a refugium, a patch of landscape where conditions remain tolerable while the surrounding world becomes hostile. The mountains of central China, the ranges that now make up Sichuan and Shanxi and Gansu, offered something the lowlands could not: elevation gradients steep enough that some band of temperature and moisture remained viable even as the overall climate cooled. Cold descended from the peaks, but the middle slopes, the zone of persistent fog and dense bamboo and old-growth fir, persisted, compressed, clinging. Into these refugia, the panda populations retreated, generation by generation, following the retreating edge of the bamboo, climbing toward the only world that still had room for them. The last glacial maximum, which peaked approximately 22,000 years ago, represents the most recent and perhaps the most severe of these compressions in the panda's experience. Sea levels at that time were so low that Taiwan was connected to the Asian mainland and Korea was connected to Japan. The great river systems of eastern China flowed across exposed continental shelf that is now the floor of the Yellow Sea. The lowland forests were gone. The panda populations that survived the last glacial maximum were almost certainly reduced to small groups scattered across the mountain refugia of central China. Clusters of individuals in the Min Mountains, in the Qinling Range, in the Liangshan and Shaoxiangling ranges of Sichuan. These groups were separated from one another, not necessarily by great distances, but by the cold, treeless corridors that lay between mountain ridges, corridors through which a bamboo-dependent animal simply could not travel. Isolation of this kind, maintained across thousands of generations, does something very specific to a species. It allows the genetic differences that accumulate through mutation and random drift to diverge between populations, gradually and quietly, the way two dialects of a language drift apart when two villages lose contact with one another. When the last glacial maximum ended, roughly 11,000 years ago, and the climate warmed again, forest returned to many of the valleys and corridors between the mountain refugia. Bamboo expanded. In principle, panda populations could have reconnected, mated across the old barriers, and blended their accumulated genetic differences back into a single undifferentiated pool. To some extent, this probably happened. But the genetic signatures of that long separation did not disappear entirely. They persist faintly but measurably in the DNA of living pandas today. The most striking example is the division between the Qinling population and the populations of Sichuan and the neighboring ranges. The Qinling Mountains, which run roughly east to west across Shanxi province and form a dramatic climatic and biological divide between northern and southern China, harbor a panda population that differs from the Sichuan pandas in small but consistent ways. Their skulls are slightly different in proportion. Their coloration is sometimes described as slightly different, with some individuals showing a brownish tint where Sichuan pandas show deep black, and their DNA carries markers that distinguish them clearly from the Sichuan lineage. Not so different as to constitute a separate species, not so similar as to suggest recent continuous exchange. The Qinling pandas and the Sichuan pandas are thought to have been separated for perhaps tens of thousands of years, long enough for distinct genetic signatures to accumulate, not long enough for those differences to have grown into the kind of barrier that would prevent breeding if individuals met. They are, in a sense, the living echo of a past separation. Two streams of panda ancestry that flowed apart during a glacial maximum and have not yet fully merged, even though the ice that divided them is long gone. There is something quietly profound about this if you let yourself sit with it. The panda eating bamboo in the fog above you right now carries within every cell a molecular memory of a world it has never seen. The lowland forests its ancestors once ranged across, the cold corridors that once separated its lineage from its distant cousins, The long isolation that made it, in some molecular sense, slightly different from the pandas in the next mountain range over. Evolution does not erase its working drafts. It archives them quietly in the long scrolling text of the genome, available to anyone patient enough to read it. And the mountains themselves carry their own complementary archive in the shape of their valleys, worn by glacial meltwater, in the distribution of their soils, layered with the dust of cold, dry glacial periods, in the altitudinal bands of their vegetation, which still roughly reflect the compressed zones of the last glacial maximum, reorganized but not wholly erased. The Panda's current range, that narrow corridor of mountain forest across 6 isolated patches in Sichuan, Shanxi, and Gansu, is not an accident or an arbitrary fact of biogeography. It is the residue of 2.5 million years of climatic negotiation, the final shape of a range that was once enormous, contracted many times, expanded partially, and then contracted again under the pressures of the last ice age, and, in more recent millennia, the spread of human agriculture across the lowlands that might otherwise have offered the panda room to expand. The ice is gone, but the compression it caused is still present, still legible, still shaping the life of every panda that wakes each morning in those high cold forests. That is the story the Pleistocene left written in the landscape, and we have been reading it together in the quiet dark. Let the thought of it settle over you like the fog settles over the bamboo. Stands at this hour, unhurried, complete, neither arriving nor departing, simply present. You can rest now in the long geological patience of these mountains, which have seen ice come and go and come again, and have kept their pandas through all of it, tucked into their fog-wrapped middle slopes, waiting. Around 11,700 years ago, something shifted in the deep grammar of the world. The great ice sheets that had pressed southward across the high latitudes began, almost imperceptibly at first, to lose their argument with the warming atmosphere. Glaciers that had filled mountain valleys like slow rivers of frozen silence started to thin at their edges, to carve, to retreat upslope, uncovering bare rock and pale mineral soil that had not seen open air in tens of thousands of years. This was the beginning of the Holocene, a word that carries in its Greek roots the meaning of wholly recent, wholly new. And yet for the giant panda, moving through those slowly warming mountain valleys of central China, the Holocene was simply the next chapter in a story that had already been unfolding for millions of years. The ice did not announce its departure. It simply became less present, season by season, until the moraines it left behind were the only evidence of how far it had once descended. And into the spaces the ice vacated, life moved, slowly at first, as pioneer plants colonized the exposed mineral soil, and then with gathering momentum as soils deepened and moisture patterns shifted, and the great forests began their long climb back up the mountain slopes. Imagine standing in one of those valleys 11,000 years ago and watching, in the compressed language of deep time, the tree line rise. Conifers first, the cold-tolerant pines and spruces and firs that could tolerate thin soils and late frosts, pressing upward along the ridges, finding purchase on rocky ledges, sending roots into crevices that had been locked in permafrost for millennia. Behind them, in the warmer and more sheltered aspects of the slopes, the broadleaf trees followed, oaks and beeches and the ancient rhododendrons, whose lineage extends far back into the Eocene. Those same rhododendrons, whose fossil pollen appears in geological cores drilled through lake beds and peat deposits, carrying in their microscopic grains a record of every glacial advance and retreat across the Pleistocene. Those pollen grains are remarkable documents. A single core from a mountain lake can contain, in its layered sediments, the entire climatic biography of a region. The sudden disappearance of broadleaf pollen during a glacial onset, the dominance of cold-adapted species through the long freeze, and then the slow return of warmth-loving plants as each interglacial arrived. Reading those cores is like reading a diary written in the language of spores and silica, a record no human hand inscribed, but one that carries, nonetheless, the full weight of everything that happened here. And bamboo is part of that record too. The various bamboo species that the giant panda depends upon today are not latecomers to these mountains. They belong to an ancient ecological guild, grass family plants that colonized the understory of temperate forests long before the Holocene, that survived glacial periods in refugia along sheltered valley floors, and that expanded upslope with each interglacial warming, recolonizing the mountain flanks in dense stands wherever soil moisture and canopy cover created the conditions they required. In the early Holocene, as the forests rose and the bamboo followed, the panda moved with them. It is possible to imagine a panda in those early post-glacial decades, moving through a forest that was still finding its new elevation, where the tree line stood somewhat lower than it does today, where the bamboo thickets were perhaps thinner and more scattered, not yet grown to the dense groves that would develop over the subsequent millennia. But the panda was recognizably itself. Its skull, its dentition, its broad cheekbones anchoring those large temporalis muscles, its elongated wrist bone functioning as a sixth digit. All of these features were already in place, refined by millions of years of evolution, long before the Holocene began. In that sense, the panda entering the post-glacial world was not a new creature. It was an old one, stepping into a new arrangement of familiar things. The Hengduan Mountains, where many of the panda's remaining populations exist today, deserve a particular kind of attention in this story. They are not simply mountains. They are one of the great biodiversity crucibles of the planet, a place where the ecological logic of extreme elevation gradients meets the extraordinary species richness generated by millions of years of climatic fluctuation and geographic isolation. The Hengduan Range runs roughly north to south through the eastern edge of the Tibetan Plateau, and this orientation proved consequential during the Pleistocene ice ages. While glaciers advanced from the north, tropical and subtropical species could retreat southward along the mountain corridors, surviving in the warmer lowlands and then expanding northward again during interglacials. This repeated cycle of contraction and expansion, playing out across millions of years and dozens of glacial cycles, generated an extraordinary accumulation of species, plants, insects, birds, mammals, each population repeatedly isolated, repeatedly brought into contact, repeatedly given the opportunity to diverge or merge. The result is a mountain system that contains, within its steep gradients, representatives of both the tropical floras of Southeast Asia and the temperate floras of the continental interior of China. Within a single day's walk in the Hengduan Mountains, a person might pass through subtropical broadleaf forest, through mixed temperate woodland, through subalpine conifer stands, and into alpine meadows and bare rock, each zone carrying its own community of organisms, many of them found nowhere else on Earth. This is what it means to be a biodiversity hotspot. Not merely that many species are present, but that the historical and ecological processes that generated that diversity have been operating here with unusual intensity and continuity. The giant panda sits within this web of extraordinary richness, not as an outlier, but as a deep participant. Its evolutionary history is entwined with the history of these mountains, with the tectonic uplift that created the elevation gradients, with the climatic fluctuations that drove the cycles of forest contraction and expansion, with the bamboo lineages that colonized and recolonized the understory across millions of years. When the Holocene began, the panda did not discover a new world. It found its old world rearranged into a particularly lush and stable configuration. The forest risen, the bamboo dense, the temperatures mild by the standards of what had come before. 10,000 years. It is worth holding that number quietly for a moment and feeling its texture. 10,000 years of relative climatic stability, the Holocene's gift to the living world, represents, from a human perspective, the entire span of recorded civilization, of agriculture, of written language, of everything we generally mean when we speak of history. And yet, placed against the panda's multi-million-year story, 10,000 years is a brief interlude, a single warm room in a much longer house. The panda that moves through a Sichuan bamboo forest today carries in its body a blueprint that was already ancient when the Holocene was young. Its skeleton, measured against Pleistocene fossil specimens, shows no substantial change. Its digestive chemistry, its behavioral patterns, its ecological requirements, all of these appear to have remained stable across the post-glacial period. What changed around the panda was the world. The forest rising and densifying, the climate warming, and then, in the middle Holocene, reaching a thermal maximum somewhat warmer than today, before gradually cooling toward the conditions of the present. The bamboo community shifted in response to those fluctuations, advancing upslope during warmer periods, retreating during cooler ones, and the panda, with its characteristic flexibility, about which bamboo species it exploits, moved with those shifts. Ancient rhododendron forests re-established themselves in the Holocene at elevations where they had been absent during the glacial maximum. Their large, leathery leaves appear now as they appeared in the Miocene, as they appeared through each of the interglacials of the Pleistocene. The same basic leaf architecture, the same relationship with the cold mountain air, the same capacity to hold snow on their canopy through the winter months and release it slowly as meltwater through the spring. Walking beneath a rhododendron canopy in the panda's current range is, in a very real sense, walking through a forest type that existed in these mountains long before our own species did. A living structure whose continuity reaches back through time far beyond the reach of any human memory. And somewhere in that forest, or perhaps in the bamboo thicket at the forest's edge, or perhaps moving slowly along one of the ridgelines above, a panda is doing what pandas have done for millions of years. It is finding bamboo. It is eating bamboo. It is resting and digesting and moving when the need arises, and resting again. The Holocene's 10,000 years of stability provided the conditions for that pattern to continue undisturbed. The forest growing denser, the bamboo thickening, the mountain world settling into the particular ecological arrangement that we now think of as the panda's home. There is something profoundly settling about the thought of that continuity. This creature, carrying its ancient blueprint through the warming years of the post-glacial world, unchanged in the ways that matter most. A living document written in the language of bone and tooth and muscle, carrying witness to an older arrangement of the world. The forests have grown tall and dense around it. The bamboo has filled the valleys, and the panda, patient and unchanged, has continued through all 10,000 years of this gentle interlude, as if it were merely a single quiet afternoon in a life measured by an entirely different clock. there is a particular quality to stillness that only very old things seem to carry, a settled weight, an unhurried ease, as though the creature or the mountain or the stone has simply ceased to be in a hurry, because time itself has lost its urgency. You can feel it in the way the mist moves through the bamboo groves of Sichuan, slow and purposeful and utterly unconcerned with anything so brief as a human lifetime. And it is there, that same quality, in the panda, in the measured rhythm of a jaw working through one stalk of bamboo and then another, in the dark ringed eyes that open and close with the patience of something that has, in a very deep sense, already waited long enough. Pull back far enough from that sleeping form, and what you see is not simply an animal resting in a mountain forest. What you see is the living end of a thread that stretches back at least 22 million years, a lineage that has been answering time's questions long before these particular mountains had finished rising, long before the bamboo had learned to grow in dense green curtains up the slopes, long before anything we might call familiar had taken shape on this planet. 22 million years. Let that settle for a moment, the way the mist settles into the lower valleys in the hour before dawn. 22 million years ago, the ancestors of this animal were already distinct, already moving through forests that no longer exist, already carrying within them the quiet template that would eventually, across uncountable generations, resolve into the creature we know. The continents were in subtly different positions. The Himalayas were lower, the climate was warmer and then cooler and then different again in ways that require entire careers of scientific patience to reconstruct. And through all of it, the line continued. Not because it was special in any triumphant sense, not because some plan was being executed, but simply because it was adequate. Because again and again, in the particular circumstances of each moment, the animals that carried these traits survived long enough to pass them forward. That is what 22 million years of persistence looks like from the inside. It looks like nothing dramatic at all. It looks like a bear eating bamboo in a foggy mountain forest. Consider what each feature of the modern panda actually represents when you hold it against that immense span of time. The false thumb, that enlarged radial sesamoid bone that works as a sixth digit for gripping bamboo stems, is not an accident or an imperfection, or even a clever workaround. It is the answer, refined across millions of years of selection, to the very specific question of how to hold something round and smooth and slightly slippery with forepaws that were originally designed by an older inheritance for something else entirely. Time asked the question over and over in the form of slightly more successful and slightly less successful grasping, and eventually the bone grew and the grip improved and the animal ate more bamboo, and that was enough. The black and white coat, those deep eye patches that have made the panda one of the most recognizable silhouettes on Earth, carries its own long conversation with time. Research into the coloration suggests it serves at least two purposes. The contrasting patches on the face help communicate to other pandas, spacing signals in a solitary life where direct encounters need to be navigated carefully, while the broader black and white of the body may offer some degree of camouflage across the variable light conditions of a life lived partly in snow and partly in shadow. Each of those pressures acted across enormous stretches of time, nudging the coat toward its present expression. The animal did not choose its colors any more than a river chooses its course. Both are the shape left by time moving through the landscape of possibility. The bamboo diet itself, so often described as puzzling, as though the panda had made a mistake, reveals something profound when viewed across the full sweep of the lineage's history. The ancestral bears were omnivores, opportunistic, and flexible, and the panda still carries the full genetic inheritance of that omnivorous past, including digestive machinery, not particularly well designed for breaking down plant cellulose. And yet, the diet shifted. Forest ecosystems in the region changed. Other food sources became less reliable or more contested. Bamboo, vast and abundant and largely untouched by other large mammals, became the answer to the question of what to eat when much of everything else had become more complicated. The shift took a very long time. It was not a single decision, but a million small survivals, each one slightly better suited to a world where bamboo was plentiful and other options were not. What looks like a puzzle from outside is, from within geological time, simply the accumulated record of what worked. The mountains themselves are part of this story in a way that feels almost impossible to hold in the mind all at once. The Hengduan Mountains, where the heart of the current Panda range lies, are among the most biologically rich landscapes on Earth, and much of that richness traces back to the same tectonic processes that shaped the Tibetan Plateau. Slow continental collisions that began tens of millions of years ago and raised terrain that then created its own weather, its own microclimates, its own steep gradients of temperature and moisture that allowed extraordinary numbers of plant and animal species to persist side by side in relative isolation from one another. The Sichuan Basin and its surrounding highlands have been, in broad terms, continuously forested for an enormous stretch of time. Not unchanging, ice ages compressed and shifted the forest bands, warm intervals expanded them, specific species came and went, but continuously, persistently forested, maintaining the ecological relationships between soil and fungi and root and canopy that make such a place possible. The panda is not just an animal that happens to live there. It is an animal shaped by and for that precise ecological context, woven into those relationships across timescales that make the word ancient feel almost inadequate. There is a meditation available here, if you are willing to follow it slowly into sleep. The panda lying still in a bamboo grove tonight, breathing in the cold mountain air, perhaps half asleep itself against a trunk wet with mist, is connected by an unbroken chain of births to creatures that walked a world almost unimaginably different from the one we know. Every animal in that chain was born, lived, found enough food and shelter, survived the particular pressures of its particular moment, and passed the thread forward. Not one generation missed, not one link absent. 22 million years of consecutive births, each one the whole world to the animal experiencing it, each one invisible and ordinary and essential. You are somewhere in your own version of that chain, of course. We all are. Every living thing on Earth tonight is the current end of an unbroken thread stretching back to the very beginning of life itself, longer even than the panda's lineage, longer than these mountains, longer than any single story we have the capacity to tell. There is a strange and particular comfort in that, if you let it arrive slowly. We are not separate from the deep history of this planet. We are made of it. The carbon in your breath has been in other forms, other bodies, other moments across billions of years. The iron in your blood was forged in the heart of a star that ended before this solar system began. You are, in the most literal sense, as ancient as anything. And the panda, sleeping in its bamboo forest, is your very distant relative. Not in any sentimental or metaphorical sense, but in the straightforward biological sense that if you trace both lineages back far enough, which would take a very long time and require a great deal of patience, you would eventually arrive at the same ancestor. Life has been trying variations on itself for almost 4 billion years, and the panda and you and the bamboo and the cold Sichuan mist are all current experiments in that long, unfinished project. What the panda offers, if you spend time with its deep history, is a kind of recalibration of scale. In the ordinary run of days, it is easy to feel that the present moment is the most significant thing there is, that what is happening now and what might happen next are the measures of importance. And of course they matter, to us enormously, the way each moment matters to the panda eating its bamboo. But place that present moment inside 22 million years, inside 4 billion years of life, inside a planet that formed from dust nearly 5 billion years ago, and something shifts, not into insignificance. The moment does not shrink, but into a different kind of proportion. The panda persisted through ice ages and warmings and forest contractions and tectonic shifts without knowing what was happening at the scale that was actually shaping it. It simply did what it did, ate, rested, moved through its mountain world, passed the thread forward. And that was, across 22 million years, exactly enough. There is something in that for the mind at rest. You do not need to hold the whole story. You do not need to understand the scale you are embedded in. The mist does not understand the mountain that shapes it. The bamboo does not understand the glacier that retreated and left the soil where it now grows. The panda does not understand that its false thumb is a 20 million year argument about how to hold a stem. And yet all of it continues, and all of it is connected, and all of it is, in the way of very old things, exactly where it needs to be. Let the panda rest in its grove. Let the mist move through the bamboo. Let 22 million years of quiet persistence settle around you, like the mountain air settles into the valleys. Slow and cool, and older than anything you need to name. The mist has settled now into the lowest hollows of the valley, pooling between the bamboo stems in slow, pale drifts that catch no light and make no sound, and the forest has arrived at its deepest hour. That still, suspended interval somewhere between midnight and the first pale suggestion of dawn, when even the insects have quieted and the air itself seems to have drawn one long breath and held it. Somewhere on the mossy slope, where the hillside softens into a gentle lean of old roots and cushioned earth, the giant panda has finished her last mouthful of bamboo. She turned the final stem slowly between her broad, practiced paws, stripped the last of its tender inner flesh, and then let it fall. She shifted her weight, pressed her broad back more firmly into the yielding moss, and let out a slow, unhurried exhale that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs alone, from the very marrow of her heavy, peaceful bones. Her eyes are half closed now, that particular softness of the almost sleeping face that every creature shares, where the world outside grows dim and the interior world grows very quiet and warm. The bamboo above her sways almost imperceptibly in the gentlest movement of cool air through the canopy, and the sound it makes is barely a sound at all, more a feeling, a faint and rhythmic sighing that has no beginning and no end. Around her, the forest breathes. A single giant panda carries roughly 48 chromosomes arranged in 24 pairs, and within those chromosomes is a library of instructions so ancient and so carefully copied that its oldest chapters were already being written before the first flower ever opened on this earth. She does not know this, of course. She knows the weight of bamboo in her paws, the particular sweetness of a fresh young shoot, the texture of moss against her flank, the slow and reliable rhythm of her own breathing. And in this moment, that knowing is more than enough. It has always been more than enough. Let the mind travel now gently and without hurry, back through the long corridors of time that brought this animal, and this night and this forest into being. The mountains at whose feet she rests are the result of a collision so enormous and so gradual that it defies easy imagining. The Indian subcontinent, once a separate landmass drifting northward across an ancient ocean, pressing into the body of Asia over tens of millions of years, folding and thickening the crust until stone rose into sky, and the Himalayas and their outlying ranges lifted themselves into the world. The Chinling and Minshan ranges where pandas live today are part of that ancient buckling and rising, and they are still, in the most technical sense, moving. Lifted by fractions of millimeters each year, a slow and patient aspiration toward height. Those mountains took their present form while the panda's ancestors were already walking the earth in recognizable shape, which means that the animal resting on this slope and the stone slope itself have grown into their current forms together, shaped by the same slow forces, breathing the same slow time. Before the mountains, there was a warm interior sea. The fossil record of the region holds the evidence in limestone and in sandstone. Ancient marine sediments now lifted high above the ocean that made them, carrying within their layers the outlines of creatures that swam through a world where no bamboo grew, no bear had yet evolved, and the land that would one day become China was only beginning to pull itself free of the water. If you were to hold a piece of that limestone and run your thumb across its surface, you might feel the faint impression of something that once had a shell or a spine, a creature that lived and fed and rested and died in that vanished sea, and whose mineral body became part of the rock that became part of the mountain that is now the panda's home. Every layer holds its own long story, patient and undemanding, asking nothing of us but a moment of attention. The bear lineage, for the panda, despite all her bamboo-eating strangeness, is a true bear, traces its origins to small carnivorous mammals that lived in the forests of Europe and Asia something like 30 million years ago. These early ursids were not yet bears in the way we would recognize them, but they carried the beginnings of bareness within them, a heaviness of build, a certain adaptability of tooth, a willingness to eat what the season provided. Over millions of years, through countless generations of living and dying and passing on whatever small advantages each body happened to carry, that lineage diversified, spread, adapted, and eventually gave rise to every bear alive today. The brown bear, the polar bear, the spectacled bear of South America, the sloth bear, the sun bear, and this one, the giant panda, who parted ways with the rest of the bear family somewhere between 15 and 20 million years ago and chose a different direction entirely. She chose bamboo. Or rather, bamboo chose her. Or rather, over millions of years of gradual change, the panda lineage and the bamboo forest found their way into a relationship of deep mutual presence, each becoming part of the other's world so thoroughly that it is now impossible to imagine one without the other. The panda's false thumb, that remarkable extension of the wrist bone that functions like a thumb and allows her to grip bamboo stems with astonishing precision, did not appear in a single generation. It was built slowly, across spans of time that make a human lifetime feel like the blink of an eye. Each tiny increment selected for because it allowed its bearer to feed a little more efficiently, to spend a little less energy, to survive one more winter and pass the blueprint on. And all of that long elaboration of form and function has arrived here tonight, resting quietly on a mossy slope, breathing softly in the mist. There was ice too in this story. Great pulses of cold that swept down from the poles and pushed the forests southward. compressing and fragmenting the bamboo habitat until the pandas that survived were only those who happened to live in the valleys and slopes where the bamboo held on. The last great glacial period ended roughly 12,000 years ago, which by geological measure is almost embarrassingly recent. A thin sliver of time, barely a heartbeat in the long calendar of the Earth. As the ice retreated and the climate warmed, the bamboo forest spread again, slowly refilling the valleys and the hillsides, and the pandas that had endured expanded with them into their recovered world. The bamboo itself returned. Many different species of bamboo grow across southern and central China, and the panda in the wild typically moves through her home range, following the seasonal availability of different parts of the plant. The new shoots in spring, the leaves through summer, the stems through autumn and winter. Each part of the bamboo offers different nutrition, and the panda has learned, over millions of years of accumulated preference, exactly which to seek at which time of year, the timing of her movements, the shape of her appetite, the particular way she settles on a slope to eat. All of this is ancient knowledge, worn smooth by repetition across hundreds of thousands of generations. Tonight, she has eaten well. She will eat again when light returns. Between now and then, there is only this: the slow breathing, the soft mist, the bamboo swaying its barely there sway above her dark and white sleeping form. Look up, if you can, through the gaps in the canopy to where the stars are visible tonight, between the slow-moving clouds. The light arriving from those stars left its source long ago, in some cases before the panda lineage had fully parted ways with its closest relatives, before the bamboo forests of China had taken their present form, before the mountains themselves had reached their current height. Starlight is time made visible, distance turned into illumination, the past arriving in the present as a soft and steady glow. The panda does not look up at the stars. She has no need to. She is already made of the same old material, atoms forged in stars that lived and died before this sun was born, pressed into molecules, into cells, into tissue, into this warm and breathing body that has found its resting place against a mossy slope in a misty bamboo forest on a summer night in a mountain range, in the heart of a continent on a small and fortunate planet circling an ordinary star. Every creature alive tonight, every panda, every moth, every roosting bird and resting deer, every small nocturnal thing moving through the undergrowth, every fish suspended in the cold clear water of the mountain stream, is the current endpoint of a chain of survival that has never once been broken since the first living cell divided in the early ocean of this young Earth, more than 3.5 billion years ago. Every one of them carries within their body the unbroken inheritance of every ancestor who managed, against whatever odds and in whatever conditions, to survive long enough to pass something forward. The panda resting on this slope is the living result of that immense and improbable continuity. So are you. So is everything that breathes tonight beneath the bamboo and the ancient stars. It is a thought worth sitting with in the quietest possible way, without urgency, without the need to do anything with it at all. Simply to hold it gently and let it open out into whatever spaciousness it naturally finds. The panda's breathing has settled now into its sleep rhythm. Slow, deep, unhurried. Each exhale a little longer than the last. Each inhale arriving as if from a great and comfortable distance. The mist drifts between the bamboo stems. The stars move their invisible degrees across the sky. The mountains hold their ancient patience beneath everything. This is the forest at rest. This is the deep hour. This is the place where time opens out into something so large and so quiet that it becomes indistinguishable from stillness itself. Let the panda's slow breathing be your breath now. Let her settled weight be your weight, pressed gently into the earth, held by the earth, belonging entirely to this moment and this rest. Let the ancient seas and the first ancestors and the lifting mountains and the returning bamboo become part of the long dream that carries you forward into sleep. You are, like everything alive tonight, the result of an unbroken chain of continuation stretching back to the beginning of life itself. And that chain asks nothing of you now but this: to rest, to breathe, to soften into sleep as the panda softens, as the mist settles, as the stars travel their slow and faithful arcs overhead. Good night, and go gently into the deep quiet that waits for you there.